Welcome, welcome, everybody. Thanks for downloading another episode of Wigs for Wigs. I'm Joe Cook, joined once again by our political panel. And today we're going to dive into a topic that we have discussed before on episodes at various times over the last couple of years, and that is the war in Ukraine. But we are going to be discussing it, hopefully focusing on its role and its connection to the upcoming election, which we are now 5 weeks away from. Am I counting that right? 5 weeks away today from Election Day. So I'm just going to start before I turn it over to everybody for their opening thoughts on this by reading a brief little thing from the State Department. This is the State Department's intro to their fact sheet on the war in Ukraine and American aid, which is going to be our topic today. They say the United States, our allies, and our partners worldwide are united in support of Ukraine in response to Russia's premeditated, unprovoked, and unjustified war. We have not forgotten Russia's earlier aggression in eastern Ukraine and occupation following its unlawful seizure of Crimea in 2014. The United States reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, extending to its territorial waters. Ukraine is a key strategic partner that has undertaken significant efforts to modernize its military and increase its interoperability with NATO. It remains an urgent security assistance priority to provide Ukraine the equipment it needs to defend itself against Russia's war. To date, we have provided more than $61.3 billion in military assistance since Russia launched its premeditated, unprovoked, and brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, and approximately $64.1 billion in military assistance since Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014. We have now used the emergency presidential drawdown authority on 53 occasions since August 2021 to provide Ukraine military assistance totaling approximately $31.2 billion from Department of Defense stockpiles. And then it goes on and breaks down what some of that aid is, which we can discuss as we go through this. But that's the State Department's kind of opening argument of why we have provided the aid we have to Ukraine over the last 3 years, 2+ years since Russia's invasion. And Bill, I know we've discussed the war before on episodes, but what are your takeaways and your thoughts looking ahead to the election in regard to the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think we need to continue to basically support the Ukraine. I know that Biden basically has committed another $8 billion before his presidency ends. I think it's a critical juncture in the war. The strategy of Zelensky and the Ukrainians to invade Russia proper, in recent months has pushed things to a critical point, especially in Russia. Right now, that Russia's inflation is about 19% because of its war footing. People are growing very uncomfortable. I think Zelensky's plan, I know he pushed Biden basically for long-range missiles to strike deeper into Moscow, and also it resulted in Putin basically saying that he would consider using tactical nuclear weapons. I don't think he would do that. I do think that it's incumbent on American national security to basically make sure that Ukraine wins. And it doesn't have to be all out wins. I think the win will come through diplomacy at the bargaining table. But I think Zelensky kind of ensured, regardless of who is elected president, that he has a bargaining chip. He still holds a significant amount of Russian territory. And I think that ultimately the goal is to win the war, not solely militarily, although they've done a very competent job of that, and the Russians have not. I think that if we abandon Ukraine, look at the effect it will have on American stature and prestige. Number one, NATO has held for 80 years, though Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Think about those Baltic countries who are members of NATO. Think about Finland, who became a member of NATO, and think about Poland, who are basically poised to Putin's expansion. Putin wants to resume the Soviet Union. I think that all of his time as president of Russia has been dedicated to that, to
Well, he
erode.
did say that the worst tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yep. And
I think I can think of one or two more severe than that, but
I think I'll leave it at that and let the others weigh in.
yeah, what exactly victory looks like in Ukraine for Ukraine, I think is a topic we can talk about as we go forward in the episode because you brought that concept up. Doctor, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I
Seniority.
certainly agree that we need to support Ukraine because certainly, it was a country which was invaded by another country completely, illegally, and it was an act of aggression. However, there are a couple of things that I am worried about. One is that we should be asking for Europe to pay more money. I think we have basically, as Americans, we have been supporting and providing free defense for Europe. Many of the European countries do not pay even 2% of their GDP. And, now that I am in Europe, when I talk to students here and other people, they don't know anything about student loans, anything about, healthcare is all free. So the Europeans have basically been getting a free ride by not spending much on defense and putting all of their money into education and, healthcare and various social services. So that is one thing. So, then the other issue, which actually I do praise the Biden administration for, is that they have to be very, very careful about, the idea of Ukraine reaching far into Russia, because Russia does have nuclear bombs. And if they feel that they are threatened or that they are existentially threatened, such as, bombs falling on Moscow and St. Petersburg, I would not be surprised if they used, as Bill mentioned, tactical nuclear weapons. Now, if they did use tactical nuclear weapons, what would we do next? So it could eventually end up with the mutually assured destruction. But I'm also not for appeasement. So one has to really tread very lightly. So I think that the idea of winning, that's really what is winning. So I think we need to put a lot of emphasis not only on helping Ukraine defend itself, but also trying to bring them to the table and trying to, push for diplomatic solution at the same time as supporting Ukraine and being very careful about this nuclear threat because, the last thing I would like to also say is that if the shoe was on the other foot, and let's say Mexico elected a government which was friendly to China, and then, of course, the Americans wouldn't be very happy about it, and then Mexico was asking for defensive weapons to be brought in from China, then how would we react? So the truth is that, the Russians are concerned that NATO is basically very much on their border, while the Americans have the Monroe Doctrine, where they do not want to tolerate any potentially hostile power in the Western Hemisphere.
I'm sharing something with all of you right now. You brought up European countries, their spending on defense, which is true. Many European countries, including members of NATO, do not spend the amount on defense that they are committed to do under the NATO agreement. In terms of the war in Ukraine, though, what I'm sharing right now, and I can post this up on the show notes for people who are listening to the podcast. It's just a site from the Council on Foreign Relations, and it's showing aid to Ukraine throughout the war. And what it shows is that the United States far and away provides the most aid to Ukraine, 69 billion plus in military aid, 33 billion plus in financial aid. But the European Union has provided, at least according to the Council on Foreign Relations, $83.2 billion in financial aid. I'm looking at the graphic. I don't see any military aid directly from the European Union, although some of the member countries have provided some military aid. But they are paying something towards this war. It's not just America funneling money into Ukraine. I mean, there are other countries that are aiding Ukraine in this. And if we look at it as a percentage of those countries' GDP, actually Estonia has provided the most to Ukraine, one of those other Baltic countries that you mentioned has actually, in terms of GDP, provided the highest support to Ukraine throughout this war. I'm just throwing it out there, some statistics to show that there are other countries, that are playing a role here. But Daniel, I want to give you a chance. I'm sorry, I didn't want to go on too long there.
So I guess we have to start with the Seinfeld scene with Kramer and Newman inside of the subway car. They're playing a riveting game of riff with one another. And there's a Ukrainian gentleman in a hat that overhears a discussion about Ukraine being weak, and he smashes their board game all over the New York City subway. And I think it's a great place to start because Ukraine is weak without foreign aid. It cannot stand on its own. What's unique about the country is that it's one of the foremost producers of wheat in the entire world. A lot of money that gets funneled in globally is to assure that there won't be food shortages, particularly for European countries because of, various exchange of good and service that goes across the Baltic, across the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal. You can sustain a lot of your economic capacity and interest by having, ample food supply. And obviously for everything that has happened globally since the beginning of, the Russia-Ukraine war, we have seen an increase in goods and service at the supermarket, at the gas pump. All of these things are so interrelated that it would take a really long time to unpeel the onion. But Ukraine cannot support itself. They are weak globally, and they need outside help to be able to do so. So in not being a NATO country, it's very easy to say, I think in the Western media, that, there was unprovoked aggression by Russia towards Ukraine. And you could say absolutely that's true. But at the same time, with a lot of the political posturing and a lot of the promises from the West to kind of deal with Ukraine in such a way that would include them as a NATO partner without actually officially doing it, you have to say was it really an unprovoked aggression, yes or no? And I think that is just a rhetorical question that we could, kind of go around for a little while. I think it's worth it to at least do that, or maybe I'll just pose it as a rhetorical question. But, for me, the way that I look at it is, the farewell speech of President Eisenhower. He warned the United States about the military industrial complex. I talked about it a little bit in the last session that we had on Wigs for Wigs. And, I think it's just clear at this point, the big boys, China, Russia, the United States, the British banks, everything that's going on globally abroad, not only with Russia, Ukraine, but things in the Middle East, are as a result of kind of these power brokering plays, to, advance regime, empire, and agenda, into the next century, right? And so if you look at Zelensky's interview on American TV 2 days ago, they asked, American taxpayers have a lot of opinions about paying for this war. What do you say about that? And he said two things that were quite interesting. I think that goes along with my point related to the military industrial complex. He said that the money that's being given to Ukraine is securing a lot of U.S. jobs related to the manufacturing of these bombs and weapons that are being sent there. That was his first answer. Quite interesting. He mentioned enterprise and commerce in a very capitalistic country. The second thing that he said was it's actually cheaper to do it this way. He said, not only in human life, but with dollars and cents. And I think that these comments are actually just very indicting of what's going on in the Ukraine. To say that it's our sole responsibility to protect that country and we live in a better world by protecting them, maybe I might buy that and understand that if I saw the West as totally morally superior, when maybe we're not. We're just making money off of the sale of weapons and arms. And that's kind of where I fall with, my perspective on the matter.
Well, you mentioned the Seinfeld scene. We got to just play the Seinfeld scene.
I'm not beaten yet. I still have armies in the Ukraine.
The Ukraine. You know what the Ukraine is? It's a sitting duck. A road apple, Newman. The Ukraine is weak. It's feeble. I think it's time to put the hurt on the Ukraine.
I come from Ukraine. You not say Ukraine weak?
Yeah, well, we're playing a game here, pal.
Ukraine is came to you? How about I take your little bullets?
Ukraine is a game to you? I think a little bit of what you're saying is suggesting that it is a bit of a game between the major powers, not just Ukraine, but some of these other weak countries that rely on support from the U.S., Russia, China, and others. So what about that, Bill? I'll turn to you.
Well, I think that the thing I agree with Daniel is that, there's never been completely black or white areas with regard to the United States and foreign policy. There's certainly a gray area. But I look to history to basically to dictate which way we should move. I see by Donald Trump's interview of a few days ago, and especially when he met Zelensky. By the way, that meeting went off extremely well. Trump did not bluster, posture, or whatever with Zelensky. Zelensky was covering the bases in terms of what the election in November will bring to him, and he met with both sides. But the truth of the matter is Donald Trump had previously to that, a few days before, had said that, he would end the Ukrainian conflict in January before he even assumed office, and didn't say how or when. I look at what he's done in the past, and it brings me back to Iceland and that meeting with Putin and the press conference after it, where he looked like he just, with the absence of a dog chain around his neck, was led around by Putin. And it smelled to me of Neville Chamberlain and appeasement. I shudder to think what would happen in a Trump presidency. First of all, the man's incoherent to begin with. He has no plan for basically anything. And to trust him with American diplomacy, he'd give the Ukraine away, plain and simple. He's also called them a defeated nation, and I don't think that's even close to reality. And what would be this interrelated world? What would happen in Asia? That would be basically what would China do with regard to Taiwan? What would it do in the South China Sea? I think that we need to have the alliances that we established a long time ago to keep peace, because with alliances comes peace through strength. Not only NATO, but if you look at what was formerly called CETO, the
Southeast Asia Treaty Organization.
Yes, basically, there's a similar initiative by the Biden foreign policy to shore that up, because those alliances were going by the wayside. America first, or isolated America, doesn't do the world any good, doesn't keep the peace, and basically shrinks our stature in the world. Not only our stature, but our national security. So I basically see this as morality to a certain degree, although not perfect. I think the sovereign country was invaded with the purpose of Russian strategic influence on the Black Sea. And not only that, in historical terms, they've always been at odds. The odds, if you want to look at postmodern history, go back to the 40s. The Ukrainians have always hated the Russians. The Russians have always attempted to subjugate the Ukrainians. And in the Second World War, when Ukraine was invaded by the Nazis, they welcomed the Nazis. They went back and forth for their effort because their mortal enemy was the Soviets and Stalin. And I don't think much has changed. And I don't think there's much a change between the foreign policy of Joseph Stalin and Putin.
Well, I don't know who is next, but I think, it's a little more complicated as far as the history goes, because the Ukrainians also were, this guy Bogdan Khmelnytsky actually pivoted towards Russia. So there was a lot of, for some of the Ukrainians, there was a lot of cooperation with Russia as well. So it was kind of a little bit mixed. And there are a lot of people, especially in the eastern Ukraine, who are kind of mixtures of Russians and Ukrainians. I mean, Khrushchev himself was half Ukrainian and half Russian. And one of the reasons why Crimea was given to Ukraine, even though most of the population there is Russian, has to do with that they never thought at that time that there would be some kind of a friction between Ukraine and Russia. So it's kind of a little bit complicated. I mean, there was also a lot of friction between Poland and Ukraine as well. And Ukraine was under the Lithuanian-Polish Empire. And they a lot of the Ukrainians feel that they were exploited by the Poles. So they were not always on the same sides, and the borders have kind of moved a lot. So, it's a little bit more complicated. But I certainly do agree with Bill that it was, an illegal invasion. It was a sovereign country, and we need to help them. The only thing has to do with maybe putting more emphasis on some kind of a diplomatic solution. When it comes to Trump, I'm totally agreeable. I mean, I agree with Bill that there is a danger he would give him away. I have a bet against Billy's brother, Tommy, who feels that if Trump wins, he's going to end the war very quickly. And I don't think that will happen, because even if Trump said no more aid from the US, the Ukrainians have agency, right? I mean, they are not just dependent on Americans. Ukrainians want to fight. I mean, the reason we lost in Afghanistan is that the Afghans threw away the weapons and ran away. But Ukrainians want to fight. Everybody thought that the Ukrainians would lose in 2 weeks. And of course they didn't. And that was not because of us. That was because of them wanting to resist. So
an awful lot of Russian incompetency.
Well, absolutely. But they wanted to fight. Like the reason.
I'm not discounting your point.
Yeah. So, I don't think that will happen. Now, just the last point is that actually, interestingly enough, under Trump, Ukrainians received a lot of arms. So Trump actually did arm them more than Obama. Trump sent them a lot of the Javelin missiles and all of that stuff. So, the problem with Trump, which certainly, as we all know, I do not support, but he what he says and what he does are often two different things.
And America can't afford that.
Daniel, that's all you wanted to get in?
So, I mean, we have some receipts on that, Billy and Michael. Obviously, Vladimir Putin is, a person who probably doesn't have much morality, a person that, is obviously very villainous in many ways. Like, I think he's killed over 30 journalists or something like that. I think the number of journalists that have tried to investigate the Clinton Association, like the number is almost equal. So when you're talking about these, essentially sociopaths at the higher upper echelon of global society, they have no problem just killing people, whether it's, a quote, Western Democrat or a dictator head of state in Russia, right? So, we're talking to people who have no qualms about squashing any sort of journalistic enterprise that questions them, whether it's covered in the media or not. So like we're dancing around the subject here that I think we really need to look at, which is how these topics are like ultimately covered, and like where the credence is to say that like Trump cannot fortify American interests around military strategy. If Hillary Clinton had won in 2016, there would have been a ground invasion with American foot soldiers in Syria. Donald Trump effectively stopped that. There was essentially the proxy from Russia in Syria, where there would have been a ground invasion, and probably, we would have seen the fires of, the World War III stoked at an earlier time than they were. We saw, Trump certainly advance and get more aggressive in Afghanistan to fortify the government that had been established there. It was abandoned by the Biden administration, the worst military blunder in American history, something that already lost any stature that we had as a respectable country with regard to foreign policy. I mean, you've seen the videotape. There's no way, there's no way to counteract that, and so, to go and mention Helsinki, I mean, all we heard for years was Russia, 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 and we heard that the Biden laptop story, was conspiracy theory. Well, that's been exposed, and I can show you the receipts on MSNBC that says that Biden family members received close to $20 million from sitting on various gas boards, and it's just beholdening the managerial class and those that hold stature in the upper echelons of society to procure certain interests to fatten their own pockets. So, like, let's actually put the cream where the crop is and try to acknowledge that certain people have profiteered off these things. By no means is Donald Trump a moral person, but you can't say that he got rich being a politician. You can say that about Joe Biden.
Well,
I think Jared and Ivanka might disagree about some of the money they've drawn in from their connection to Donald Trump.
first, can I address some of those things? I think Dan's trying to rewrite history here. First of all, that's purely hypothetical. What would have happened under a Clinton administration had she beaten Donald Trump in terms of a ground invasion of Syria? I also think that the person who set up the abandoning, and most likely it was probably the right thing to do, albeit too late, was Donald Trump. He set that in motion. Biden did not basically distinguish himself, the Biden administration, with the actual pullout.
But the withdrawal was a disaster. I mean, let's just get that on the table.
I mean, but the pullout was necessary. I mean, we should have been out of Afghanistan after we killed bin Laden, or kept just a small footprint there. I mean, we achieved our ends in Afghanistan by ending the Taliban, for all practical purposes as a threat to the United States. And honestly, how can you basically say anything or posture anything about Trump militarily when he went through national security advisors, joint chiefs of staff like people go through underwear? The man basically wouldn't listen. All foreign policy was dictated through him. And I'll leave it with this. And the most egregious part of his foreign policy was basically the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords enriched one person, and that's his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who walked away with $2 billion from the Saudis to refinance 666 Broadway project, which the banks were foreclosing on. And the truth of the matter is it laid the seeds to what's going on in Gaza because it excluded the Palestinians from the table. It was a sham, the whole thing.
And we'll talk about Israel Gaza in another episode.
I won't talk any more about it, but it gives credence to the fact that Donald Trump's foreign policy was a disaster.
Well, as far as the Afghanistan go, obviously it was a disaster. However, what we have to understand is it was Donald Trump who actually negotiated with Taliban without the presence of the Afghani government at the time, the withdrawal date. So Donald Trump already set the stage for the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And, in defense to Joe Biden's administration, they did not expect that they would fall so quickly. And it just shows you that the countries have agency. The Afghani people just did not want to fight. They probably preferred to have the Taliban to the installed government by the Americans. This Ashraf Ghani, or previously the other guy, what was his name? I forget now. Yes, that's correct. Yeah, so Hamid Karzai, that's correct. So those guys are basically installed by us, and it sounds like that the Afghanis did not want to. They would prefer the Taliban because they just left, and the Taliban got all of our arms. So, but to kind of like say that if it was Donald Trump, it would have never happened, I would say that's extremely unlikely because he was the one who wanted to withdraw. I also believe that it is totally. I would say that if it was Hillary Clinton, she would not invade Syria. I mean, if you think about it, Obama, he was criticized for not enforcing that red line when the Syrian dictator Assad decided to use the gas. Obama really didn't do anything. So, so I doubt that she would have done much. As far as the Abraham Accords, I agree we should talk about it next time, but that's where I do not agree with Bill. I think they were pretty major achievement.
Yeah, one of you, I think Bill said that there's always a difference between what Donald Trump says and what he does. I think the same is true of any member of the Clinton family. So let's not assume that anything that Hillary Clinton ever said she was going to do, she was ever going to do.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about living in Europe, and maybe, Michael can speak to this, is that it seems like Europeans are way more concerned with the neocon conservatism of the Democratic Party. Like, the way that a liberal is defined in Europe as to the way it's defined in the US is like so very much different. Like, if the Democratic Party does not represent liberal ideas or liberalism as it was like spelled out by John Locke, right? We've clearly seen that with suppressing information and silencing people. And this is sort of like the policy of like modern liberal progressivism, whatever that is. But like the reason why I say that we have receipts is that Donald Trump did not advance wars when he was president. The same cannot be said for Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, certainly Barack Obama. Wars that were in place continued under Trump. Some of them got more aggressive because of positions that they were in after the drone bombing that Obama assumed on Yemen for 8 years. We are talking about Ukraine. And the concern here is that if you had a Kamala Harris White House, you know, she's very much just a puppet. I mean, let's be honest here. She's a puppet for the managerial class. And she represents everything that neoconism is. And the advancement of American foreign aid for military actions and military action will expand if, God forbid, she became president. So, like, there are receipts. And I think if you're interested in diplomatic solutions, you don't vote for a Biden Waltz Harris Waltz ticket.
But let's talk about a diplomatic solution to this war. Coming back to kind of what we were saying at the beginning of what does quote unquote victory for Ukraine look like? I mean, if America is interested in Ukraine winning this war, I mean, obviously that's not going to mean the total defeat of the Russian military and the toppling of Vladimir Putin, right? I mean, that's not victory for Ukraine. So what does victory actually look like in the real world for Ukraine? And, you know, if Donald Trump does have this super secret plan to end the war very, very early, which he had in Afghanistan, by the way, too, when he was running in 2016, but that's beside the point. What exactly does that victory look like, that negotiated settlement look like?
For me, really quickly, because I spoke last time, I'll speak quick, is it's economic policy. And it's using the gas reserves effectively, opening up the pipeline, making very smart decisions for American enterprise to do business, and not hamstringing people with bogus capital gains laws that are going to prohibit people from doing business globally. And we're not just talking about the 1% and the elite and people that, you know, drain money out of their trust. We're talking about people who actually provide goods and services globally, who otherwise wouldn't be able to do so if they were taxed on their unrealized capital gains. So an administration under Donald Trump does that, and ultimately solid economic policy is what's going to win the war in Ukraine, not bombs, guns, and tanks.
I don't know. I think that what victory looks like for Ukraine to get its sovereign territory back, to have
all of it? You mean the Crimea also? I mean,
yes, the Crimea also. I mean, that's up to negotiations, and that's why diplomacy is so important with regard to this. I know that one of the things that diplomacy does, it's give and take, and I think some of the give and take has to assure that there'll be non-military access to the Black Sea for Russia. And also, too, that Ukraine recedes its military forces from Russian territory, and that boundaries are established, and that, you know, Russia signs on to this. They certainly have to. Now, Daniel had made a term, the neocons, the Democratic neocons. Well, you know, I think I'd go with the Democratic neocons rather than the Heritage Foundation, because I think that Trump's administration, potential administration, will be guided by their concepts, where the rich would get richer. I respect Daniel's looking out for the middle class and what he was talking about. But the truth of the matter is the middle class will shrink under any Trump administration. And it's been proven before that, you know, when corporations pay their fair share of basically the costs of America, the middle class benefits from that. There's never been a program where you basically give tax breaks to the top and expect it to trickle down. Didn't work for Reagan, didn't work for Bush, didn't work for Bush too, and it won't work for Donald Trump. You know,
well, it's okay. My child care is going to be covered by tariffs somehow.
I think we are drifting away from the Ukraine. So from my point of view, as far as the what would peace look like? I mean, right now it's kind of a war of attrition. So I think it's kind of unrealistic that Ukraine will regain by war all of their territory. So for me, it would be ceasefire and go to the negotiating table and try to work something out, because a lot of it has to do with, should Ukraine get some guarantees for security, you know, what the borders should look like, But, it could be negotiated at the table while there would be immediate ceasefire without further casualties. The only problem is that Putin is not interested in it. So I'm still hoping, and maybe I'm being too idealistic, I'm still hoping that once the casualties on the Russian side increase, there will be pressure from the Russians themselves to stop the war, just like the Russians left Afghanistan because they were suffering too many casualties. Right now, Putin is recruiting people from places like Nepal, India, the Asian areas. He doesn't want to use people from the European parts of Russia or from the middle class or upper middle class families. So he's just trying to basically pay people who are poor in Russia, or, as I said, even recruit from India and Nepal, people to go and fight, as well as, people from prisons and so on and so forth. But, perhaps, that would persuade him. So I would, so for me, it would be immediate ceasefire and going into the negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, Russia is poor. It is a country that's not holding on to much. So this is why they're choosing a war of attrition, because it gives them a certain advantage. I mean, at least the oligarchy, to hold on to their regime and to preserve power for as long as they can. So there's going to be no diplomatic solution with a person like Vladimir Putin. It doesn't exist. The greatest thing is to put economic standing on the world stage back at a place where we can do business with one another. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of advantages to America doing business with Russia, particularly because of the oil reserves, because of the position of Alaska, and I'm not talking about pillaging all of our natural resources. I'm just talking about making good, solid decisions so that we can put the world on track to cooperate. One of the best ways to disarm war is to figure out how to make money together. And, if you want to go back to Helsinki, I think, everyone jumped on Donald Trump for somehow like being beholden to Vladimir Putin, but no one made the same criticism for Obama visiting Saudi Arabia when he first became president and bowing down before their king. And so, let's just really understand it for what it is. This is a war over commodities, and America now is scrambling because our leaders have not made decisions in Washington for the American people. They've made decisions for covert fascist global elite to preserve their power globally. And so, unfortunately, it doesn't really seem like the United States of America really exists anymore. And I think the future of the ideals of America are more secure under a person like Donald Trump than under Harris and Walz.
See, that's where I don't agree with you. I think that it's not a war over commodity. I think it's a war regarding security. I think the Russians feel, just like the Americans would feel, that the NATO is kind of expanding further towards them. So they don't want to be surrounded by potentially hostile nations.
I kind of, if I had my druthers, I basically would, go with the American ideals rather than a man who espouses authoritarian leaders. When he at the debate talked about the leader of Hungary as a role model, as an exemplar of leadership, I said, how the heck this guy wants to be?
He mentioned Putin in that same answer.
He did. I mean, and honestly, you're going to accuse the Democrats of fascism. That's like the pot calling the kettle black. It's completely absurd. There's a guy who espouses authoritarianism, espouses fascism, would be, if he could, change the Constitution where he could lead for the rest of his life. When he bows down to people like the leader of North Korea and cherishes him, has a love affair with him, what does that tell you? Take the man for what he says, at his word.
He obviously would not be able to change the Constitution, so let's not go down.
So the New Yorker printed an article yesterday, should we torch the Constitution? The New York Times had an op-ed, in their paper a couple of weeks ago about should the Constitution be amended? So everyone accuses Donald Trump of this, but actually it's just explicitly said in some of the biggest liberal, quote unquote, media papers across the free world. So, as far as the pot calling the kettle black, yeah, I totally get it. But the thing is, Donald Trump is not trying to pretend that he's something else than he is. Mrs. Harris very much is doing this.
Well,
She presents herself as like your friend that's going to give you a hug at a mini market, but is very much not going to protect your interests of ideals going into the future.
the pot would call the kettle black, but it just realized that the pot just suddenly turned black. It was Indian.
You know, I'm fine with soul food, and I'm also fine with chicken tikka masala. They're both amazing. You know, I think we should celebrate ethnic diversity personally.
Well, I come back to that notion that, I do believe that Trump is a pathological, malignant narcissist. So he does have proclivity towards dictators, and I think he himself would like to be dictator. The only thing is that he doesn't have enough cunning and enough attention span to actually do it. In order to become a dictator, you have to be really kind of an evil genius, and you have to figure out how to get the army on your side. And, we could have a whole another discussion on that, but I just don't think
we could do a whole episode on dictators. I mean, if we wanted to, but
right. But I think he would want to be one. I mean, he would enjoy being one, but I don't think he has the capacity of doing it.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's just be really fair here. With regard to Russia and Ukraine, let's just be honest, guys. There's not a clear-cut solution here. It just seems out of reach. I mean, it kind of started with George W. Bush, where there was the big, Iraq war going on, and there was, the annexation of Georgia. And it kind of just all unraveled in the region at that time, because I just think they weren't ready for that. And there really wasn't a plan for it. And then with everything that Obama did with NATO in the region, with all of the ballistic missiles in Poland, etc., a lot of Obama's policies continued into Trump's first administration, and kind of we're in this position that we are in now because of mistakes on both sides of the political aisle. The question is, do you think that a Harris-Walz administration is positioned to deal with a very active military situation like this, other than a photo op at the border for 20 minutes and getting some token quotes? I'm surprised she didn't wear white when she did that, but I'll throw it back to Bill.
Well, I think yes, and part of the reason of that is that I think that administration of Harris and Walz would basically attract serious-minded, competent people into the administration. And I'll give you one that I think is extremely competent, and is basically our current Secretary of State. And I think that those are the types of people that would not be attracted to a Donald Trump administration. Who would he get to basically fill those positions? He would look for sycophants, yes men. He's not going to look for career people. He went through military leaders who had a tremendous amount of gravitas, like he changed his underwear. And I don't think that administration would look anywhere near the competent administration that Harris and Walz would bring to the table. There aren't any easy solutions, but I do agree with Michael that a ceasefire and parties agreeing to going to the table, with a competent person who could basically mediate, that could possibly bring an end to the war. One of the things that, Daniel, you alluded to, which is important, the area of the world that most suffers from this conflict is Africa. Africa is starving. The Ukraine basically exported tons of grain to Africa to help them. And whenever the grain was halted by Putin, basically those people were more in suffering. And maybe that's added to the political instability in Africa. And as you said, everything is interrelated. And that's certainly one of the terrible parts of this, not only for the Ukrainian people, but also for the people in Africa who basically can't provide enough food to sustain themselves.
Yeah, any instability in the global north is always bad for the global south, to use some international relations terminology here. But certainly Africa has suffered under this. We do have to wrap up, unfortunately. I ironically, because you brought up John Locke a few minutes ago, have a class coming in that I'm about to teach about John Locke and the Enlightenment philosophers. But just as modern liberalism, I don't think is much of a reflection of John Locke in the United States, I would also say as somebody who considers myself a conservative, that modern conservatism does not exactly reflect Edmund Burke very much in the modern United States. So I want to go around. I want to give everybody their chances for your last thoughts on this episode. We can certainly discuss some of this again in another episode now that we're kind of figuring out a more regular schedule, now that the school year has started and we can do this. But Bill, I'll actually turn to you first for your closing this time.
Well, I just hope and pray that basically that the war does end, and it ends basically that with a solution that gives into somewhat to both sides, because has to be a mediation. And I do think that a Harris-Walz administration would be better equipped to deal with that. But I also want to harken back to Ronald Reagan and also to Richard Nixon. They believed in détente through strength. And I only think sometimes Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly, carry a big stick. Unless you basically support Ukraine militarily, the Russians will never come to the bargaining table.
Just to keep score for people who have been listening to our show from the beginning, in the last 2 episodes, we've gotten Bill to praise Dick Cheney and Ronald Reagan. So I think we're on the right track here. Daniel and Teddy Roosevelt. Well, Teddy Roosevelt, everybody loves Teddy Roosevelt. So Daniel, I'll turn to you next.
Yeah, I think in a discussion like this, probably we all agree that war is necessary, and war is something that's really ugly, and it's unfortunately a part of our human experience, and ultimately it's going to play out in the way that it's going to play out. It's probably not going to be a rushed closure. It's going to find closure because of all other global matters that have found solutions. And I think there are many exterior factors to the reason why Russia and Ukraine went to war with one another, outside of just their, ethnic, cultural, and land conflict that they've had over the last century. But if you're going to look at it from a diplomatic perspective with regard to foreign policy and the way that America funds these wars, I think, we'll talk about it in another episode, like, the U.S. finding funding for Israel, in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually, and obviously we're coming up on, I think it's just about 50 billion for Ukraine. If you're talking about direct military funding, or somewhere between 30 and 50 billion, the American taxpayer should not be on the hook, especially when you have plenty of people that are cut off from a highway in the middle of Asheville, North Carolina. The infrastructure is not in place in America to make such decisions across the sea when we can't even take care of our own. And so I would like to see, not an isolated America from the world, but I think America can certainly afford to pull back and make policy decisions that benefit people domestically, so that we can actually live out the ideals that we fought for at the beginning of the inception of the Union in 1776.
It was George Washington in his farewell address. We referenced Eisenhower's farewell, right? Washington is the other great farewell address in American history, American presidential history, who warned about entangling alliances, right? America over involvement in Europe and the risks that would pose to America's founding principles. So I agree with you on that idea. Doctor?
Well, in the words of Rodney King, I always think of, why can't we just get along? So, I think it was a really interesting discussion. I still hope that somehow, those two sides can come to the table and resolve it in a mature way. It's just so unfortunate that so many young men who have lives ahead of them are dying on both sides for no reason whatsoever, just because of the human frailty and anger and kind of envy and ridiculousness. Basically, that's just sad that so many people are dying around the world, and certainly in Ukraine and Russia. So I'm just hoping that whoever comes into office in America, whether it's Trump or whether it's Kamala Harris, they will try to promote some kind of a diplomatic solution, but also, from the position of strength. I think one thing we haven't mentioned is that Russia is still able to trade oil at a discount to China and to India and countries like that. So they are not exactly poor. So because they are still making a lot of money on with the oil, so that should be something also to be addressed. But ultimately, I think the solution has to be diplomatic. But unfortunately, America, we have to also understand we only have like a limited power over nations who are fighting against each other, because ultimately it's, as I said before, they have agency.
Yeah. As you said, the Ukrainian people have shown a willingness to fight for themselves in a way that the Afghan people did not in the withdrawal of the United States, which led to ultimately what will go down as the failure of that war and that withdrawal being a disaster. President Kennedy famously said that mankind, well, actually, no, it wasn't President Kennedy, it was Martin Luther King, said that mankind must bring an end to war, or war will bring an end to mankind. And whether it's directly the casualties of this war, the people killed in Ukraine, the soldiers on both sides, the civilians, whether it's indirect casualties of this war, the people of Africa and elsewhere suffering from food shortages and things like that as a result of the war, the displaced people that are putting on a strain on resources in other countries that we haven't talked about, the refugees from Ukraine and other war-torn countries that are, of course, straining the countries that they are moving into, places like Poland that we have given a couple mentions to in this episode. It is, I think we all agree, whether our personal opinions on how it should play out exactly, that the war has to end. Right. This we can't have this war go on forever. These endless wars. Right. This isn't a war directly involving the United States, but it does need to end eventually. And you're right. There are no easy solutions. I wanted to pose that question that we did today. What does victory look like for Ukraine? Right. What does it actually look like? And I don't think any of us have an answer that really Vladimir Putin would accept. And that's the unfortunate part of it. I don't know if Zelensky would accept some of our solutions. So I don't know the answer to these things. I think we've had a good discussion today, but it's critical. Whoever it's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or XYZ and the other person, whoever comes into office in the future, it has to end. We have to find a solution to this, and I want our listeners to have a chance to reach out to us with their thoughts on the war, if it matters in their vote, because this was ostensibly about how will this impact the election. What maybe people think a solution in Ukraine could be that might bring peace. So as always, listeners, we can be reached at Wigs for Wigs, the name of the show, that is WIGS FOR WHIGS at gmail.com. We do love hearing from you. I think we're going to have a listener question episode soon that will respond to questions that we've gotten from our listeners. I think that would be good with all of our perspectives. But take care out there, all of you who are listening. Reach out to us with your thoughts, and we'll see you again soon for another episode of Wigs for Wigs. Take care, everybody. And go Mets.